Well, as you can see, I'm going to be talking about Wireshark's past, present, and future. And before I get into the talk, I need to make it clear that Wireshark's past and present were determined by people who were involved in the project and people who participated. And since you're right now participating in this project, it would behoove you to help us shape the future of the project, because that's one of the opportunities you have right here, right now, this week. I don't know if we're going to have time, but I did have some time set aside at the end of the talk to maybe talk about the future of the project. But if we don't have time here, you're welcome to stop by the developer den, which is upstairs, and talk about any features or directions that you want to see in Wireshark in the next 1 or 5 or 10 years. Yes? What?
Oh, you got it. You're all set.
Oh,
That's for the guys whenever they come.
Okay. So Wireshark started in the late 90s, and I thought I'd make a joke and pull down this picture of a stone axe and make fun of the fact that we used to use this, software that people don't really use nowadays called CVS to manage our source code. But as I worked on this slide, I realized that compared to modern open source projects, we really did start in the caveman days, because back then, if you wanted to set up an open source project, you had to do everything yourself. You had to build your own website, your own bug tracking system, your own mailing list, repository, and all this other stuff. And so that's what we did. I also did, old school caveman style bartering for bandwidth and hosting. I would trade consulting time for, just to put our server somewhere so that we would be online. And we also had a caveman name, which was Ethereal. That's the first name of the project, and we ended up changing it when I switched jobs in 2006. But all this stuff sort of shaped how we manage the project today. We still actually manage a lot of our own infrastructure, our own, the website and the mailing list and so on. Whereas most open source projects nowadays, they get on GitHub and they're done. A lot of the milestones for the project can be measured in how useful we were to people over time, as we added support for platforms and we added support for protocols and features in different industries. This doesn't represent any hard data, because I didn't really have it handy, plus PowerPoint is terrible at showing you hard data. But as you can see, really early on in the project, before we actually did the first release, Ethereal was useful to me and the 3 coworkers that I showed it to at work before I made the first public release. Once I did make the first public release, it was useful to people on Linux and Solaris, because those were the only 2 platforms I used, and those were the only 2 platforms I was interested in. But when I did make that first release, a bunch of other people started contributing, and suddenly we had support for IRIX and HPUX and AIX and so on. And then later on, the surprising thing to me was that somebody added support for Windows. I had no interest in Windows, but other people did, apparently. The first Windows release, really early on, around 2000, 2001, they weren't good. I'll just say that. They were this little zip archive you could pull down. I don't know if anybody used Ethereal, really way back when in the early days, but it was just this zip archive with a few executables in it, and that's all you got. Once we had an actual real Windows installer that let you install Wireshark with just a few clicks, and it shipped with WinPcaps, which made capturing a lot easier, and all that other stuff. Once we removed that friction of installing Wireshark, that made it useful to any Windows user anywhere, as long as you're allowed to install it. And that really kind of exploded our user population. And that's how we got a pretty good sized user base. We also added support for Mac OS. Apple early on supported X11. It shipped with an X11 server with the operating system. And then over the years, Apple decided they hated X11, so it got harder and harder and more difficult to support Mac OS. And finally, with 2.0, we're back to supporting Mac OS users pretty well. And in the future, we might expand out to mobile platforms. I'm not sure. That's one of the things we need to talk about this week. Wireshark's like any other product. Whether you're making software or candy bars or automobiles, you're going to have barriers to entry. It's just a standard thing that you encounter. And these are the things that keep people from adopting your product or even looking at it or trying it. And Wireshark has plenty. Probably the biggest thing is that the notion that packets are this magical forbidden knowledge. That you shouldn't be looking at the network, or these things are just way beyond the scope of normal people. I mean, packets are just packets. They're not really self-explanatory, but they're just blobs of data at the end of the day. And that's something we learned here at SharkFest, and that's something Laura is really good at communicating to people. Another thing Laura talks about as the second point is that packet capture for troubleshooting for a lot of people is a method of last resort when it should be maybe the first or second. And getting over those two barriers is kind of something we contend with all the time. The last two we run into occasionally, especially the open source one we don't run into much anymore, but a lot of IT departments don't let you install Wireshark. They have a policy against it. My employer, Riverbed, ships Wireshark with every laptop. I'm really happy about that, but I think we're the exception there and not the rule. And being open source was a barrier to entry, especially early on in the early 2000s, because a lot of companies had policies against using open source at all. Hansong talks about that occasionally at Citigroup. He had to go get special permission to use Ethereal early on. And one of the ways I've gotten around that, the last point, the open source barrier, is it's kind of sneaky, but I try to make sure that the Wireshark website looks like a commercial website. So you don't necessarily know it's open source. I mean, it's pretty obvious if you go click on the developer tab, you can download the source code, but for a lot of people, they just go download the installer and they don't really pay attention to the fact that it's open source. And because of that, it removes that barrier, but at the same time, sometimes I get requests for quotes for Wireshark. And I mean, it's really easy, $0, 0 cents, done. One of the big things early on that removed barriers was LoRa. I remember I would be working in my office and I get this email from this lady named Laura, around 2002, 2005-ish. And she'd always send me emails asking if she could use Ethereal in her training courses. And I didn't know who she was. Fine, sure, go ahead and do that. But as it turns out, having a voice of authority, an expert advocating on your behalf and telling people to install your software is really important. And that increases adoption of your software. And we've been very fortunate in that, not only with Laura, but people like Betty and Hansong and Jeff Carroll and all these other people that really train and push, and Graham. Actually, all the speakers here. I'll just make that blanket statement. Reducing installation friction, like what I was talking about with the last slide, or a couple of slides ago, with the Windows installer. I migrated a lot of our infrastructure over the past few months, and I tried out different software packages to see if it would work well with what we were trying to do. And some of those packages, especially on the sysadmin side, if you've looked at installing, say, a log analysis platform, you need 18 different required packages and a database and all this other stuff, and it's really hard to install. And so some of those packages I just didn't even look at because the requirements list was 3 pages long. If it's maybe it's good, but I don't have time to install that, and I don't have time to administer that. So, having conferences and attending conferences and events and meeting people face to face also removes barriers to entry. I've sat down and talked with people, and they hadn't tried Wireshark before, and well, you just install it. It takes 5 minutes. But telling people that face to face really helps increase adoption as well. And finally, thanks to Janice, we do have SharkFest. Having a dedicated conference for your software adds a lot of legitimacy to your name and helps and kind of increase whatever value you have in people's minds. The fact that we have a conference, maybe we're not so bad after all, even if we are becoming open source. And speaking of SharkFest, as you might know, we're on the 10th one in the US. Excuse me. And I just thought I'd share a couple of memories from that first one. It was the first time I met a lot of you who have been here before, and actually, a lot of people over time that I'd communicated with email, before, but never met face to face. So that was really fortunate. Excuse me. Met a lot of the developers for the first time, at SharkFest'08. One of the really dumb things I did was I thought it'd be really cool during the conference to release 1.0.0. It's a bad idea, but what I ended up doing was I was, a bunch of the developers and I sat in the breakfast room at the hotel, and I went through. This is not 1.0.0, but it's a copy of a release checklist for Wireshark. It's 3 pages long and has a bunch of checkboxes and takes a while to go through. And I sat there releasing software when I should have been, maybe mixing with people and meeting them. So, plus, making a release during a conference is just stupid. One of the recent milestones, if you hadn't noticed, about 18 months ago, we switched user interface toolkits in the stable release. We switched from GTK to Qt. And it was a lot of work, a lot of effort, and it's still ongoing. So a perfectly valid question is, why go through all that pain and trouble? The big reason was that Wireshark, like any other type of software, depends on other people's code. We pull in software libraries for doing various things, like either decryption or user interface or looking up host names or various things like that. The user interface toolkit we were using, GTK, is primarily developed by people at Red Hat for the GNOME project, which is a Linux desktop. They do an awesome job of that. If you run Linux and run GNOME, it's a nice interface. However, 0 of those developers are dedicated to supporting GTK on Windows, and 0 are dedicated to supporting GTK on Mac OS. They don't release any binaries, they don't do any testing, so you're kind of on your own on those platforms. So, we may do initially, but over time it just got to be more and more of a problem, so I started looking for alternatives and kind of settled on a different toolkit called Qt, which actually does support each platform, Linux and Windows and Mac OS, kind of as tier 1 platforms. And they also support platforms like iOS and Android and others. They support embedded platforms, so you could theoretically have Wireshark on QNX in your car display. But don't know if anybody's doing that. So you're writing a new UI. What are your 2 main goals? Your 2 main goals are, don't leave users in the dust, so make sure that everything looks exactly the same as the old user interface. And by the way, we need to fix all the problems from the old interface, all the bad things we were doing. And those are conflicting goals, but we kind of, I think, pulled it off, mainly, for the most part. But that was kind of that was kind of part of the struggle in writing the new UI, to be honest. When you do develop a new UI, something you need to be very cognizant of is what sort of mental models your users have. I mean, I have my own mental model of how packets go across the network and how they travel through a switch and other types of hardware and how they go through your NIC and end up in front of you in Wireshark. And I know it's not 100% correct, but it's correct enough for my uses. And I'm sure everybody else here has their own mental models of how the network works. The important thing we need to do in Wireshark is make sure that whatever we display, whatever we put in front of the user helps them shape that mental model and do it correctly. And so before I started writing the new UI, I read a few books by guys named Edward Tufte and Don Norman, and they're kind of the go-to people for basic design theory. Edward Tufte, if you haven't read any of his books, he writes books on information visualization. And they're very beautifully illustrated books with all sorts of really cool charts and diagrams about really depressing things like cholera and dead astronauts. But they're beautiful books. You should read them. Don Norman writes books about design, about the psychology of design. And he has If you've ever walked up to a door and it's really not obvious how to operate the door, and you realize that civilization's been around for a really long time, like millennia, and here's this, doors have been around for a while, and yet it's not obvious how to operate the door right in front of you. That's called a Norman door, just because he complains about that sort of thing. Doors should be obvious in their use, but they're not always. Sometimes it's just a sheet of glass with a hinge. Where do you touch it? As an illustration of that, I know these are drawers and not doors, but this was a picture of a hotel cabinet. Well, it was under the sink in my hotel room a few months ago. It was this panel under the sink, and they added design accents like handles and slots and stuff, which made them look like drawers, but then they had to add sticker that says, these drawers do not open, because they're not drawers. And, the reason I had the slide up is we kind of inadvertently, it's really easy in software to play tricks like this on users. Especially, one of the complaints people have about mobile UIs is that everything's flat. How do you know what to touch? How do you know what to click on? Because it's just all basic geometric shapes that are basic primary colors, and it's not really obvious what you should do. And so it's something that I tried to be very aware of when developing in UIs, not to do that sort of thing. It's also important when you write software to set the proper tone. As you can see at the very top there, you can see the left-hand side of the toolbar for the new UI and the old UI. In the new UI, I moved the Start Captured button to the very first item, and I did that, on purpose because capturing is a primary function of Wireshark. You want to get packets. On the old UI, you had two buttons for configuring the capture interface and configuring your capture. Well, that's all well and good, but that's not what you do 8 hours a day, when you're using Wireshark. The line below that, the git log command, if you run that in Wireshark's repository, you see a bunch of commits from me saying we shouldn't yell at the users. We had a lot of error dialogues and a lot of error messages that were kind of, they were mostly informative, but they were also kind of aggressive. And if you're having trouble using software, the last thing you want to do is have it yell at you. So, I went through a couple of times and made a pass through all the code and kind of changed that. Little things like that. We had cases where on the old UI, if you pulled down the various analysis and statistics dialogues, before seeing the dialogue, you would see a quiz you had to take, a kind of a preempted dialogue that asked you to fill in a display filter. Well, I can really see why we had to do that initially with the old UI, and I could see what was going on in the developer's mind, and the reasoning was valid, but at the same time, I don't want to take a quiz before seeing a graph. I want to see the graph, and so that's one of the things I tried to fix in the new UI. We also provide hints if you mouse over stuff or right-click. We try to be more informative there. Let's see. After releasing the new UI, there were some feedback surprises. A lot of comments on the welcome screen that how minimal it was and how a bunch of stuff was missing. Well, if you compare the new UI to the old UI, all the same stuff is there. It's in kind of different places, but there's also a lot less clutter, which I kind of expected comments, but some of them were kind of surprising. One of the things we tried to fix was the display filter bar. One of the main complaints we had about the old UI was that the display filter entry was too narrow. And with the new UI, that was an easy fix. That was like an automatic fix. It just automatically expanded to the width of the title bar. And I thought, great, we have fixed a problem that people complained about. Except with the new UI, now people have a complaint because they don't have enough room for for filter expression buttons. So, because the display filter is too wide. So now we have to fix that. We'll figure it out. And finally, one of the surprising things was on Mac OS, Apple has this document called the Apple Human Interface Guidelines, and it's been around forever. It tells you how Mac applications and iOS applications should look and feel and work, and they're very specific about a lot of things. One of the things they're specific about is the preferences menu item. It should be under the application menu, in this case under Wireshark, and you go down, and there should be a preferences item, and it should have a keyboard shortcut, command comma. And the GTK UI did not do that, but the Qt UI does. And I thought, this is a wonderful thing. I have fixed a user, just an actual real documented user interface issue. But I had multiple people come up to me and said, where do the preferences go?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I'm sorry?
And the color rule button.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm just saying.
And in my head, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? They're in the correct place. Go to the correct place, do the correct thing, and like any other application on your computer, and you're fine. But I kind of, I also realized that by doing this is a bit of a major change, and we kind of pulled the rug out from under people because they're expecting something completely different. Well, enough of me complaining. I'm going to turn the microphone over to the rest of the core developers and maybe let them share their stories and complaints. Sure, yeah. Okay, this is working. Okay. Tell us a story, Graham.
Yeah. Okay, my name's Graham Blois, developer by day. I work on SCADA control systems. And early at the end of last century, SCADA was moving from being serial lines to telemetry stations and starting to take on Ethernet. So therefore, we started to have to analyze our data traffic over Ethernet. So that's where I found Ethereal. Didn't quite work for bits that I wanted to see, especially as we were on a Windows platform, and it was the early days for Windows. We couldn't do live capture. And that really frustrated me that all the Linux guys could and the Windows guys couldn't. So I started working to enable live capture on Windows. Of course, I wrote some stuff and it seemed to work, but we've all thrown that away now and gone to a much better system with DumpCap. So that's how I got started into Ethereal, and I've stuck around now nearly 2 decades now to help out.
So I'm Simon, maybe some of you have seen me yesterday as well. And Wireshark or Ethereal back in the time can be a life-changing event or a life-changing thing, because I was working at the end of the last year at a large bank, and I got notice of Ethereal, some features, so I started developing. Well, first I wanted to ask for the feature, and it's open source, so I started developing myself. And I was developing under Linux because I didn't know how to develop under Windows. But I wanted to use it in the Windows, so every time I developed something, I wanted it to be automatically built. So I nagged the whole team, like, come on, build it, so I can download the automatic installer and use it on Windows. And that's probably why you invited me to join the core team, because I was nagging too much. But since I started the core team, the SharkFest happened, and I went to SharkFest and met people that work for themselves in this business, and I started my own business like 7 years ago. And so it can be life-changing. So thanks for the project.
Hi, I'm Roland. I came to Wireshark, I think, like most of the core developers, by fixing the problem. Actually, I'm kind of a stubborn person, and people at work are telling me that the protocol I was working with can't be dissected with Wireshark, and I say, let's see about that. Then some years ago, 2013, I think, Mike Kirschner gave a talk at SharkFest about external capture utilities, and he might want to do that as a final version of Wireshark. For some other reason, they didn't come around to it, but I needed that, and so that was the next thing I wanted to fix, and I did it myself. And this is basically how we work. So we fix things which annoy us, or you annoy us a lot, then we fix it for you. That's very badly worded, but it's... Sorry, I'm a European, so... No, but I wanted to just give a shout out, because there's one little item on Gerald's list that's gonna be my thing I'm gonna do next year, and Laura already, I'm not sure she proposed to me, but she was very, very happy when I showed it. She was really glad. So I'm gonna change something again in the user interface, and hopefully you guys like it. But if you don't, please come by and develop then to tell us what you want to see in the future and what you want us to fix for you. We're happy enough to do it, even if we don't need it. He wanted the search bar to not disappear, so we fixed that. So come by, yeah, I need this guy. I have to fix the icons now because I forgot that. So come by, tell us what you want, tell us what you like about Wireshark. We always want to hear about that as well. And yeah, it turns out to be positive for you in the end.
Hi, I'm Stig, and I've been working with Wireshark for I think 15 years or something. And now I just switched to working with IoT. And with IoT we have different devices, like this. This is my thingy. And I can touch my thingy. And this is a Bluetooth device with all sorts of sensors. It has temperature and pressure and CO2 and everything. And I can connect with my phone. But it's really difficult to trace with Wireshark today. All the Bluetooth packets going from this device to the iPhone. So this is, I just started picking up the XCAP from Rodon and trying to make a Bluetooth, like capturing the Bluetooth traffic, not going to the computer. This is like some of the future points we are working with. So if someone is interested in capturing Bluetooth and Bluetooth, you should come to the developers then and talk to me. Because talk to my thingy. Actually, this has a cloud service integrated. So if you connect, you could post to Facebook. So when you click the button, you will get the posting on the Facebook. I just touched my thingy. So it's very nice. Come by and see it. I don't have the thingy. Well, I do. My name is Chris Maynard. I've been involved with Wireshark or Ethereal for about 12 years now. My involvement began when I had to write a client that communicated across the WAN to our servers, and I needed to understand the protocol that we were using. We were in a class given by PMG at the time, and the instructor noted that you could write your own custom dissectors, and I thought, I need to do that. So I began writing and had questions, and so some of these gentlemen here were kind enough to answer those questions and help me. Over time, I caught on for the most part, and was able to give back. And so I thought, well, how can I help the project to kind of, help out others as I was helped. So I started with a bug list, and I don't know how many we have now. There's quite a few. This talk is, past, present, future, and I think the future is part of, the people in this room. Maybe many of you are beginners, but over time, as you learn how to use it or develop with it, you may also want to contribute back as well, submitting patches or helping answer other people problems and questions that they might have on the Ask Q&A forum, whatever you might be able to contribute, because it's an open source project and you're all part of it.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Anders Broman. I got in contact with Wireshark around 2003 when I was changing over from working with fixed exchanges and going into voice over IP stuff, and we realized that we needed to see the packets and to understand what was going on. And the system I was working with at the time was using 323, which is an ASN1 based protocol. And Wireshark didn't support those protocols at the time, but there were a couple of guys came along and made a tool to automatically generate dissectors from the ASN1 descriptions. And I thought that looked really interesting, so I started to do a few of those my protocols with those tools, and things just spiraled from there.
I guess anybody else?
I'm a shy guy, I will come on stage, but let's give it a try. My name is Pascal, I'm from France. The funny thing is that I started using Wireshark not to capture packet at all. I mean, I was working in the wireless industry, and I just discovered that I could get out of those crazy bytes all the magic of it and the meaning of it. So just came out that, yeah, we had a pretty crappy logging tool in my company just to capture the packets that were sent by our mobile phone to the network. And I discovered that thanks to people like Anders, those dissectors were already available because they had the same need on the network side, and just found a way so that I could feed Wireshark with the bytes and just getting the decoupling out of it. So I started contributing because Anders did not work well enough, so it was not complete for my needs, and then contributing during a few months, bringing some announcement to Windows, etc. And I remember one morning I received an email from Gerald proposing me to be part of the team, and wow, I was impressed. I mean, I feel definitely honored to be part of this story and just to bring my pieces in it, and since I've been enjoying it, really.
Hi, I'm Peter. I actually, many of you have actually started working with Wireshark. Because they had a problem on their own. Actually, I started developing Wireshark because I was trying to learn about things. I was trying to learn about some VNC protocol that my VPN provider was using, and I couldn't decrypt it. So at that point, I started digging and sort of, what's going on? Why is it not working? And I started to fix it. And as time progressed, I found more things that I was learning about, and figured it's not entirely working. It should work, but isn't it working? So it's a whole work. And for me, developing on Wireshark is actually a learning process. I really want to know how are things working, and if I see something weird, then I try to fix it. But you can use Wireshark also, for example, for reverse engineering a protocol. So, there was an RC channel for Wireshark, and there are also some users passing by and saying, "Oh, hey, I'm looking at this game, and I don't really understand it. So I'm writing Wireshark dissector. That's great." Better do it this way than coming by and act I want to learn Wireshark. Then my next question would be, why would you be willing to learn Wireshark? And if their answer is something like, I want to hack Facebook passwords, Twitter passwords, then I'm like, okay, you're doing it wrong. That's okay. It's a great resource for learning.
Hi, I'm Martin from Germany. I got involved about 5 years ago when I was working on digital televisions. I was looking at a pay TV system where you have a car that's talking to the TV set, and a colleague of mine built a hardware to get the byte stream of what the two were talking about, and it was a protocol based on packets. So we had access to the data, but we had no nice way of displaying and analyzing things. So I thought that could be integrated in Wireshark, and I had a go. It was well before this XCAP thing came around, so I had to do a bit more than I would have to do now. So that got me involved, and I found out that even after doing just a little bit, there was a huge benefit in things that we could see, that we could understand, that were very difficult to see before. And yeah, that got me involved in the project. I stayed around, helped other people, and I have to agree with what Peter said. It's a great learning experience being on the team. I learned so much from these guys and from all of you, and that's great.
My name is Michael Mann. My day job work with industrial protocols. A lot of it is the industrial Ethernet. I started using Wireshark. There were dissectors for the protocols I used, but they were incomplete. So I started working on them, improving on them. And I sort of stuck with Wireshark and looking at other dissectors in that some of the protocols I work on are complex enough that I know that you can look at more complex dissectors and get sort of design ideas to do some of the tracking request responses and just sample code and how to do that. A lot of the dissectors out there in Wireshark are all cut and paste. And one of the things that I'd like to see working on Wireshark is just to get some of the dissectors that are already there better so that when people cut and paste, you're going to have better code. Good code begets good code, bad code begets worse code.
Yeah.
And sort of the other thing, I mean, yes, Wireshark is mostly C, but in the entire tool set, there are a few other languages that you can learn about and play with. So that's sort of where I started getting exposure outside of C, writing Perl scripts and all that other stuff.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you. I know we're running a little long. Sorry about that. So I'll try to skip through these quickly. As far as the future goes, we currently have some problems we need to solve. One is that cloud capture is terrible. Last week, one of our developers was having trouble doing Git pulls, and so I thought, and we migrated to AWS recently, which I like AWS, I love it. It has a lot of really nice features, but at the same time, if you want to capture packets, like it says on the slide, you get to run tcpdump or tcpdump in a container, or if you're really advanced, tcpdump in a container in a pod. This is not cool. This is less useful than 3Com SuperStack 2 switches that I used in 1997. And so that's a problem we need to fix. Next slide. One of the problems we have with Wireshark is that networks are getting faster. I mean, that's a really great thing and wonderful thing for the rest of the planet, but this came across my Twitter feed. Apparently later on this year, you will be able to buy a bare bones 32-port 100 gig switch for less than $3,000 from a couple of different manufacturers. That's awesome. My wife's not here, so I can say that maybe I'll have 100 gig at home. But, maybe. No, but the thing is, 100 gig, if you do the math, 100 gig, 64 byte packets, full line rate is 148.8 million packets per second. If you double that for full duplex, you get 296.7. If you say, okay, my customer's having trouble, I'm going to capture those many packets per second, and I'm going to do a 500,000 packet capture. Well, you have 1.7 milliseconds to go through the okay, try it now loop. This is not good. This is something we need to work on and address. So maybe that's something we can talk about in the developer day. We have a bunch of other challenges. We only use one core. Well, okay, maybe 1.1 of your cores, because we have a few worker threads that don't really do a whole lot. My laptop is not new, it's not fancy, it has 8 cores, and Wireshark uses 1. And we also let you open one file. I had somebody came in and asked about this yesterday, as a matter of fact. This is a big problem on macOS. You get one copy normally of Wireshark. There are ways to work around it, but which means you get one file to look at. That's maybe not so useful. As Michael mentioned, we write everything in C, which was an okay idea 20 years ago. But since then, a bunch of competing languages have come out that want to replace C, like Rust and Golang and Swift and even C++. Maybe we should be looking at those. And developing open source software on Windows is terrible. It's awful. this is a big deal for us because we have a lot of developers who use Windows, and we deliver an installer on Windows. And this means that we have a bunch of developers who are sitting down, setting up their, spending half a day setting up their development environment when they should be writing code. And it's a real problem. One of the big questions I get is when we're going to drop support for GTK because we have a new UI. And I just don't know. We have this shows kind of how we've been migrating the different platforms over. Mac OS, if you want GTK, you can get it through Homebrew, but we don't deliver it just because, it'd be hard to make the installer do that, for one. We've been talking about dropping GTK. Maybe that'll happen with 2.6. With 2.4, it's not built by default, and it's not installed by default on any platform. Well, except Linux distributions get to do what they want, so I have no control over what weird stuff they do. And we have a bunch of other future prospects, and this isn't anything official, it's just a bunch of things that people threw out yesterday that I kind of typed into the slide. Running multiple capture files, maybe seeing multiple PDUs in a frame, or switching to an MSI installer, a whole bunch of ideas that we could look at, and maybe this will kind of pique your interest and maybe come down to the developer then to talk about us. And we have no time for audience participation, sorry about that. But this is the slide I was trying to get to. It's important for me at the end of each talk to say this, but as I mentioned at the beginning, Wireshark is shaped by the people who participate. And right now you guys are participating, and the developers have been participating for a long time, and I feel honored to be part of this. I mean, this is such a big and great and wonderful thing, and it's because of these guys and because of you, and I cannot thank you enough. So, thank you.